In the previous lesson, I showed you how to use Laravel's DB class to query your database. So we can do things like this: DB using the user's table, where the username does not equal Jeffrey Way, grab everything that matches. Or if you ever need to do generic select statements, you could say DB select star from users. You can do stuff like that. And the same will be true for things like if you need to run an insert statement, then you can do that. However, there's a cleaner way to go about this using Laravel's ORM. Now, ORM stands for Object Relational Mapper. This gives us a clean way to map, for example, a database row to an object. Let me show you what that looks like. If I open up App Models User, you can see that every Laravel installation includes a user Eloquent model. That means we can immediately make use of it. Now, when we create this user model and we extend Eloquent, behind the scenes, this is telling Laravel that we also have a users table. Now, we can override what that table name is, but by default, it's going to follow a convention. So the user Eloquent model is going to expect a table called users. Now, if we wanted to do this exact same query, we could say users equal user, where username does not equal Jeffrey Way, then get the results. And that'll do it. So now if I switch over to the browser, we are returning all the users that match that query. Now, what if we want to grab all users? This is fairly common. Well, Laravel makes that really easy. User all. This will map to select star from users. If I come back, reload, now we've pulled all rows, and in this case we only have 2. Similar to the query builder, we can do things like user find by ID. This will fetch only one row and then map that to an object. But what if we want to create a user rather than fetch one? Well, we could say user equals a new instance of the user class, and now we can specify our fields much like object properties. So I could say user username equals new user, and then the user's password will be password. However, I'm betting you know that this is a bad idea. You never want to store your passwords in your database in clear text. Luckily, like many things, Laravel makes this really easy. We can just run it through #make, and Laravel will take care of the encryption. Now that we've set all of the related fields, I can just call user save to save that user to the database. Now, to verify that it worked, why don't we just return user all? However, this isn't going to work exactly like we'd expect. If I try it in the browser, I'm going to get this exception here, unknown column updated at. So what's going on here? Well, by default, Laravel is going to expect to see a created at and updated at timestamps. However, in this case, we don't have them. So we need to tell Laravel that for the user model, there are no timestamps. That being said, this table right here is just an example. For most of your tables, it likely makes sense to include those. It certainly couldn't hurt. But nonetheless, it's a good example to see how we can override that. Here, at the top, I can say public timestamps equals false, and that should do it. Now, if I switch back to the browser and reload, our user was added to the DB, and we can see that reflected here. Great, very simple. However, there are alternate ways that we could do this. In addition to this method, we could also call a method called create. I could say user create and then pass an array of the fields. So in this case, username, another user, and the password once again will be #make1234. Now, what do you think is going to happen when we run this? Well, let's see. I come back, reload the page, and now we will get a mass assignment exception. And I imagine that to newcomers, this is a little confusing because we see in the documentation that we can do this. However, we try to, and we get an exception thrown. So what's happening here? Well, in the past, it was very common to do something along the lines of, in whatever framework you happen to be working in, call a create method, and then simply send through the post data. So you would do something like this. This would be the Laravel equivalent. However, there is a security concern in doing this. Because post data can be manipulated, the user could potentially update fields in your database table that you don't want them to update. Now, in most frameworks these days, that has been resolved. So what's happening here is Laravel's trying to protect us. So what do we do in this case? Well, I will switch back to my user model, And now I'm going to use a protected property called fillable. Now this is a way for us to say which fields may be mass assigned. The opposite of this, which you could use if you prefer, is guarded. And in this case, you would say everything is fine for mass assignment except this array of items. Generally though, most people use fillable. So in our case, I'm fine with username and password being mass assigned. Now let's try it again. If I come back and reload, it worked. So if I switch back to my routes file, we now know two different ways that we can create a user. But what if we want to update a user? Well, in that case, we need to find the user. Why don't we update the user with an ID of 2? So user equals user find 2. Now we will update a field. Why don't we say updated name and user save? Notice how easy that is, incredibly easy. So let's try it. If we did everything right, foobar should now be updated name. Refresh, and it works. And this is the great thing about Laravel. Whenever you are trying to figure out how to do something, more often than not, it's just the most obvious way. Find a user, update a property, save it, you're done. Now, we've learned how to create users, select users, updated users, but what about deleting a user? Well, even if you didn't review the documentation, I bet you could figure it out. User equals user find 2. This time we will delete this user entirely. Find that user, call user delete, and once again we are done. Refresh it, and now that user has been removed from the database. So now that you understand the basic CRUD operations, we can also do any of the things that you would normally do with a MySQL query. For example, what if we want to return all of these users, but we want them ordered by the username in alphabetical order? Well, we could just say this: return user order by username in ascending order, and grab all of the results. Now if I come back and reload, it works. What if we only want to grab a subset? Maybe we only want to take the first 2 that match. Well, just like we spoke it, we use the take method. Come back, reload, and now we only took 2. All right, so that's going to do it for this lesson. This gives you enough to play around with. So on your own, play around with creating a new model, performing these CRUD operations, and really try to get comfortable with this. You will be using this stuff constantly, so it's vital that you learn it.